It began, as many stories of ambition do, in a quiet village tucked into the Bavarian countryside. Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter was born in 1961 in Siegsdorf, Germany, a place so small that secrets didn't last long and dreams often felt too big. But Christian's dreams weren't just big, they were delusions wrapped in desire. From a young age, he showed a talent for mimicry. He could imitate voices, accents, even entire personalities. He watched American TV with obsession, repeating lines from old detective shows and westerns, imagining himself in those worlds. America wasn't just a country to him, it was a stage, and he was ready to become someone else. By the time he turned 17, Christian had set his sights on the United States. Not as a tourist or a student, but as someone determined to vanish into a new skin. He convinced an American couple he'd met in Germany to sponsor him, claiming he was eager to learn, to study, to explore. With charm and clever wording, he secured a visa. In 1978, he stepped off a plane and onto American soil, an unremarkable teenager with a suitcase full of lies. In Connecticut, he enrolled as a foreign exchange student. But it didn't take long before the name Christian Gerhardsreiter began to fade. He didn't want to be German anymore. He wanted to be someone else, someone important, someone who belonged. He soon moved to California, drifting between cities, taking up odd jobs, and studying the rich and powerful. He watched how they dressed, how they spoke, how they demanded respect. He copied their manners, their words, their confidence. He started telling new stories about himself, each one bolder than the last. By 1981, Christian had a new goal: to stay in the United States for good. And to do that, he'd need something more permanent than charm. That's when he met Amy Gersel Dunke. She was young, kind, and trusting. Christian told her he needed help. He said he was in danger of being deported. Whether out of compassion or manipulation, Amy agreed to marry him. On paper, it was legal. In reality, it was a lie. They were married one day. By the next morning, Christian was gone. Amy never saw him again. But this wasn't the end of his deception. It was only the beginning. After vanishing from Amy Dunke's life without a trace, Christian Gerhardsreiter did something that would become his signature move. He disappeared and reemerged as someone else. This time, he was no longer a wide-eyed exchange student or a desperate immigrant. He became Christopher Chichester, a name that sounded regal, polished, and ambiguously aristocratic. He arrived in the upscale community of San Marino, California, where money whispered and questions were considered impolite. To the neighbors, Christopher was charming, intelligent, and impeccably mannered. He claimed to be a filmmaker, sometimes a descendant of British royalty, and at other times related to European aristocracy. He walked the streets with quiet confidence and spun tales with a perfectly polished accent. In a place where appearance was everything, no one dared look beneath the surface. But behind closed doors, Christian was aimless, jobless, and dangerously unstable. He lived rent-free in the guest house of a local couple, John and Linda Sohus. He told neighbors they were reclusive. Then, one day in 1985, the couple vanished. When questioned, Christopher claimed they had gone to Europe, and then he too disappeared, this time leaving behind only questions and an empty guest house. For years, their disappearance remained unsolved. By the time investigators became suspicious, Christopher Chichester no longer existed. He was now Christopher Crow, this time popping up across the country in New York and Boston. He wore tailored suits, spoke with a mid-Atlantic accent, and claimed to work in finance. He even applied for high-profile jobs using fake resumes that listed degrees from Ivy League schools and job experience at top firms. He forged Social Security numbers. He conned landlords. He even talked his way into jobs without showing ID, because people wanted to believe him. Christian wasn't just faking a name. He was performing a character, living it, becoming it. He studied every detail, rehearsed every backstory, and molded himself into whatever the situation required. But for all his aliases, one name loomed above all others, a name so powerful, so revered, it would open every door and silence every doubt. Rockefeller. He wasn't ready to use it just yet, but the man who would soon call himself Clark Rockefeller was learning, preparing, watching, because the greatest act of his life was still to come. By the mid-1990s, Christian Gerhartsreiter had left behind more identities than most people change haircuts. But this time, he wasn't just assuming a name. He was reaching for royalty. It wasn't enough to be Christopher Crowe, or Chichester, or any of the lesser names he'd worn like temporary disguises. Christian wanted permanence, power, prestige. He wanted to be Clark Rockefeller. In America, the Rockefeller name wasn't just respected, it was sacred. It conjured images of old money, oil empires, Ivy League universities, and political influence. It was the kind of name that didn't require proof, only suggestion. And Christian, ever the actor, was a master of suggestion. Clark Rockefeller appeared in the Northeast like fog, mysterious, quiet, impossible to pin down. He lived in exclusive neighborhoods, dressed in cashmere and tweed, spoke in soft, assured tones. He said little, yet gave off an aura of immense wealth. People didn't dare ask too many questions because Clark Rockefeller seemed too refined to be questioned. Through carefully cultivated mystery, he embedded himself among the elite. Country clubs welcomed him. Art auctions courted him. Wall Street types respected him. It was a con built on silence and elegance. And then there was Sandra Boss. She was brilliant, a Harvard graduate, a senior partner at McKinsey & Company, a woman whose intellect could cut glass, and yet she fell for the illusion, or perhaps for the way Clark carried himself like a man above earthly concerns. They married in 1995. She thought she was marrying into American royalty. They had a daughter in 2001. Behind closed doors, Sandra managed the reality of life with a man who handled all finances, refused to drive, didn't like being photographed, and avoided modern technology. But she trusted him, or more precisely, she trusted the name. He played the role of doting father and eccentric genius. He filled their home with books, art, and silence. He wore the mask so long, so perfectly. Even he began to forget there was a man named Christian underneath. But something always felt off. By 2007, Sandra could no longer ignore the cracks in the glass. She began asking questions he didn't like. And when she dug too deep, the illusion crumbled. She discovered the truth, that there was no Clark Rockefeller, that the man she'd married had no past, no degrees, no verified family, no wealth. He was a phantom. The marriage ended in divorce. Sandra gained custody of their daughter. Christian, now stripped of his mask, seethed with quiet fury. He had built an empire of lies, and in one sharp unraveling, it was all taken from him. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The mask had fallen. The name Clark Rockefeller no longer held power, no longer whispered awe at country clubs or opened quiet doors to hidden privilege. His marriage was over. His empire of lies dismantled. But one thing remained: his daughter. To Christian, she wasn't just a child. She was the last piece of the world he had built, a living link to the Rockefeller illusion. And now, she belonged to Sandra. The courts had ruled against him. He was granted only limited, supervised visits. Every hour with his daughter was monitored, watched, measured. To Christian, it was humiliation. It was defeat. It was unacceptable. And so, he made a decision. On a warm afternoon in July 2008, in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, Christian met his daughter for a scheduled visit. A social worker accompanied them, walking the streets with quiet, professional vigilance. Christian was calm, smiling, holding his daughter's hand, speaking softly as always. Then, without warning, he struck. In one violent, desperate move, he shoved the social worker to the ground, snatched his daughter, and fled. He jumped into a waiting vehicle, a borrowed SUV, and vanished. The country erupted in shock. The man who had once walked unnoticed through elite society was now the target of a nationwide manhunt. The FBI released a photo of Clark Rockefeller, though most didn't even know that name wasn't real. Sandra Boss pleaded for her daughter's safe return. Authorities scoured airports, bus terminals, private docks. Christian had no clear identity, no paper trail, no known destination. He had disappeared so many times before. Could he do it again? For 6 days, the search intensified. The media dug up his past aliases. Experts speculated on his next move. But for the first time, Christian Gerhardt's writer wasn't in control of the narrative. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a con man. He was now a fugitive. On August 2, 2008, federal agents swarmed a modest carriage house in Baltimore, Maryland. Inside, they found Christian with his daughter, safe, unharmed, and unaware of the firestorm surrounding her. The arrest was quiet, the moment unremarkable. But behind it lay years of deception, manipulation, and secrets. For Christian, the fantasy was over. But for investigators, the real story was just beginning. Because now that he was in custody, they started asking questions no one had asked before. And what they found buried beneath the lies would lead them back in time to a forgotten murder. The arrest of Clark Rockefeller made headlines around the world. But as the FBI began peeling back the layers of Christian Gerhardt's writer's true identity, they unearthed something far more sinister than forgery or fraud. They found a corpse. In the days after his capture in 2008, investigators combed through his past aliases. One stood out like a blinking red light: Christopher Chichester, a name Christian had used decades earlier while living in San Marino, California. That alias was tied to a cold case that had haunted the quiet suburban neighborhood since 1985. Back then, Christopher Chichester had moved into the guest house behind the home of John and Linda Sohus, a reclusive but friendly couple. Neighbors were curious about the polite, peculiar man in the guest house. He claimed to be writing a book or filming a documentary, depending on the day. He seemed harmless. Then, one day, the Sohuses vanished. Christian told neighbors they'd gone to Europe. No postcards ever came. No calls, no emails. Just silence. Soon after, Chichester himself disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a trail of mystery and suspicion. For years, the case went cold. Then, in 1994, workers digging in the Sohuses' backyard made a grim discovery: bones, along with plastic bags and remnants of clothing. Forensic analysis revealed they belonged to Jonathan Sohus. His wife Linda was never found. Authorities didn't know who Christopher Chichester really was. No fingerprints, no social security number, no trace. Until now, when Christian Gerhardt's writer was arrested in 2008, detectives connected the dots. Chichester was, Rockefeller was Gerhardt's writer. The aliases collapsed into a single chilling truth. This wasn't just a man who fooled society. He had killed someone to protect his lie. In 2011, prosecutors filed murder charges. The case that once baffled California detectives was now reopened under a flood of evidence and public attention. The trial was set for 2013, and the stakes were monumental. Because what started as a missing persons case had become a murder trial against a man who had lived half a dozen lives, and all of them were lies. By 2013, the name Clark Rockefeller was no longer whispered in awe. It was spoken in courtrooms, printed in headlines, and dissected on national television. But it wasn't Clark Rockefeller who stood trial. It was Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter, the man behind the names, behind the disguises, behind the bones found in the yard of a quiet San Marino home. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. After decades of deception, the phantom had finally been caught. Reporters filled the benches. True crime enthusiasts followed every motion. Prosecutors weren't just trying to prove a murder. They were pulling back the curtain on one of the most bizarre imposter cases in American history. The charge? First-degree murder in the death of Jonathan Sohus, who had vanished in 1985. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but it was chilling. Prosecutors presented the timeline. Christian had lived on the Sohus property under the name Christopher Chichester. Jonathan disappeared. Christian fled. Years later, Jonathan's remains were found, buried in the very backyard where Christian had once resided. The defense offered explanations, deflections, even distractions, but none of it erased the mounting coincidences. The lies had compounded, and so had the truth. Witnesses came forward from Christian's past, landlords, co-workers, ex-acquaintances, each one offering pieces of the puzzle. Stories of name changes, faked accents, fabricated histories. The jury didn't just see a murderer. They saw a man who had constructed an entire life out of fiction. It was not just about a single crime. It was about decades of manipulation. A pattern. A performance. The verdict came after 5 weeks of testimony. Guilty. Christian Gerhartsreiter was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison for the murder of Jonathan Sohus. He had already been convicted in 2009 for kidnapping his daughter, receiving 4 to 5 years for that crime. Now, with the murder conviction, his freedom was gone for good. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where the man once believed to be a Rockefeller now occupied a 6-by-9-foot cell. No tailored suits, no hidden identities, no audience, just walls and silence. San Quentin, concrete, steel, silence. Here, Christian Gerhartsreiter no longer played a part. No one called him Rockefeller. No one bowed to his fabricated pedigree. The name stitched on his prison uniform carried no history, no influence, no myth, just a number. And yet, outside those prison walls, the myth continued to breathe. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers were drawn to the enigma. How did one man fool so many? How did he weave a story so convincing that even those closest to him didn't see the seams? The television movie, Who is Clark Rockefeller?, aired in 2010, dramatizing the deception for millions. Books followed, podcasts, documentaries. Audiences leaned in. But behind every retelling was a deeper, more unnerving question. How many more like him exist? Letters trickled into the prison, some from curious strangers, others from those still wrestling with the version of him they once knew. Christian, never short on confidence, responded with restraint, sometimes philosophical, sometimes cryptic, always in control of the narrative. He paced his cell like a stage, read endlessly, wrote with precision, maintained the quiet detachment of a man who had once engineered his own mythology. The guards noticed his politeness. Other inmates kept their distance. There were whispers, of course, about the man who claimed to be a Rockefeller, about the murder, the child, the lies. But Christian said little. The man who once lived through illusion now lived through routine. 3 meals, 1 hour of yard time, and silence. Lots of silence.